to episode 169 of the Craft House Magic podcast. My name's Ellie and I'm coming to you from Norwich in Norfolk in the UK, and today is the 17th of June. So welcome everybody. I hope you all had a lovely crafting week since the last time I've spoken to you, and I'm here to share all the things that I've been making in the last 7 days. So today I have some knitting, I have some crochet, cross stitch, some sewing, and then I have a question from the Ask Me Anything thread, and I have some suggestions for what to knit with a single 100-gram skeins of yarn, and also 5 20-gram minis, so different patterns that you can use those for. So watch out for that. And then I just have some information on my shop update at the very end of the podcast. So you can find me on Instagram, Ravelry and Facebook as Craft House Magic, and I have my own website, crafthousemagik.co.uk, where you can find my hand-dyed yarns, handmade project bags, stitch markers, knitted needles, crochet hooks and bag making supplies. So we have a couple of make-alongs going on in the Ravelry group and on Instagram. I'll leave the details to those in the description bar down below. But we've got the Craft 20 a day, which will go on right till the end of the year. But I will be drawing prizes at the end of June for those. And the Spring Shawl Along will end at the end of June. So make sure you get your entries into that thread or on Instagram as well. So let's get on with the knitting, shall we? So first of all, I have a finished object. And this is something that I put the minis together, but Liz has knitted for me, and it is the Habitation throw by Helen Stewart, and it is a small throw or blanket which is made with fingering weight yarn but 20-gram minis. Now the original pattern, I think it gives instructions for 10-gram minis and to use 24 of those, but I had quite a few 20-gram minis. So I put those together in a sort of colour order so that they blend quite nicely and it would be quite balanced over the whole thing in 20 grams. What Liz did was she actually used up all of the yarns apart from some of the very last one, and I think there's about 10 grams of that one left. So it's a good use to use up lots of minis that you've accumulated. So there we go. It's got a lovely simple lace pattern, which I just absolutely love, and I did block this so it's got some nice drape to it as well. So you could use this as a throw on your lap, you could use it as a baby blanket, and you could also use it as a shawl. So you could fold it in half and then have it, oops, and then have it over your shoulders like so, or you could wear it sort of around your neck like I do with normal sort of shawls and tuck the ends in. It's a bit more like a cowl, I suppose, because it isn't mega long once it's folded over, but you can see what I mean. But it's very versatile and you can use it for lots of different things. So I thought that was a good pattern to use some minis in, and I really like how it's come out. I don't know where all the yarns are from because they were in my basket, which is behind me there, which I've picked out. So a lot of the pink ones have disappeared, but I've got like a tonal pink, a pink with blue speckles in, a deep purple, a grey with pink and yellow, there's a very pale grey with some grey and pink speckles on. I think this one might be a Giddy Yarns one out of one of her mini sets that I've purchased recently. I don't think I know any of the others, but basically it's just sort of striped all the way along, and you can see where that's where it's been started with a mini being used up. So you don't have to do it like that, you could just do a couple of rows of the pattern in each colour and switch it up, but this sort of makes sure that you use up yarn that you're putting into it. So there we go. That's the first finished object. I think that'll be nice to have on my knee in the sort of summer's evening when it's starting to get chilly. It's not a very thick blanket or throw, but it does look really pretty and quite useful, I think. So next on my knitting, I have a garment that I've started. So I did swatch for this. If I can find the swatch in my bag. It's got a bit creased now, but I did block it afterwards. But I am knitting a cardigan, which is the Sparkle cardigan by Locatelli. I'm knitting it in this pink yarn, which is called Pretty in Pink. That's my little swatch. The bit here where there's garter stitch at the sides, that's just a bit of excess over the there's 21 stitches across there, which is what it suggests to knit for the gauge, but I've done 5 stitches in each side in garter stitch just so that it lays better. And then I tend to never really knit the full square in terms of the length of the work, because I think it's more important that the width of the work is more accurate to the gauge. It doesn't matter so much about the length because you can just keep measuring it as you're knitting it. And I haven't done very much, but it's going to be a lovely lacy cardigan. And it does say in the pattern that you can't really see the lacy bit until you've blocked it out really, but you get the idea that there's lacy rows all over the cardigan. And this is actually sort of the back of the cardigan, just up here. It's all knitted all together rather than in separate pieces, but you do pick up stitches in this pattern. And when I get a bit further along, I'll tell you a bit more about the construction method. But it is a paid for pattern, so I can't say too much. So this is what the yarn looks like in the cake. So it's a sort of a dusky pink, and I've picked my merino nylon base, which is 75% merino, 25% nylon, which is a nice and soft base, but with a little bit of nylon in there, it lasts a little bit longer. I'm using the needle sizes that Joji suggested in the pattern, and I hit my gauge with the gauge swatch, so I've just picked the size that I'm going to knit. So what I've done actually is I measured my upper bust measurement, and I'm going to knit that size for just above my bust there, and then I'll do some increases so I've got a bit more room for my bust area. But I do find that if I knit the larger size that fits my chest size, that it does end up too big on the shoulders, so I will do some increases around the bust area. With it being a cardigan rather than a jumper, I'm not going to do short rows to make like a boob pocket, as I call it, because I think that when you've got a cardigan you don't want it to be longer at the front, because if I have it open it will just hang strangely, so I'll just increase around underneath the armpits just so that it gives me a bit more room around the bust area. So that's how far I've got on with my garment, but I have been doing quite a bit of crochet. Now I showed you last week that I'd done a rectangle of the Battenberg blanket, and I have done a row down this side and a row down the bottom I think, and a few extras, but I have done quite a few extra squares that I need to put into it. I just need to add it into the main body of the blanket with some undyed yarn. So I'm using the undyed yarn, which is my merino nylon base, and I have that available as undyed yarn in my shop as well. I'll leave a link to that in the description bar down below. But I just love this. I've actually started to pick some of the brighter colours, I think, just to have little pops of colour. I'm trying to do a mixture of paler and slightly brighter colours in this one. I'm trying not to go too dark or too bright, but I think that the odd little pop of a brighter colour like this turquoise here, I think looks really nice. So that's how far I've got on with that one. It just probably doesn't look much from last week, but they do take a little while to sort of put together. Hopefully I'll get these all attached by next week. So my next section is my cross stitch section, and I have finished the back stitch from last week on my bookmark. So this is the bookmark that I was working on. So last week I'd done all the cross stitch bit, and now I've finished all the back stitch, which is the black outline on all the little hearts and things, and some definition around the chocolate flake at the top. I also added some French knots onto the strawberries as indicated by the pattern. So this pattern actually comes as a kit with all the threads and everything together, and now I've just got to put it together. There's some backing material and also a tassel to put it together as well, so I'm excited for next week when I can have a completely completed cross-stitch bookmark. I will leave a link to the pattern in the description bar down below, well the kit that you can get, with also the materials I tend to use for cross-stitch as well, my favourites, in the description bar down below. So I am so pleased I managed to do that back stitch. I actually, before I started, I left it for a day or so before I got stuck into it after the last week's podcast. But once I got started on that back stitch, I actually quite enjoyed it. Once I sort of started up here, and this bit is quite dense in terms of the back stitch, but as I worked down, it got quicker and quicker and quicker because there's quite a large expanse here of colour rather than the black outline. But absolutely love it. And my next section is sewing. So I have been really busy making these covers. So I showed you last week that I'd made a cover for my overlocker, which I showed you in full detail. And then I've made a cover for my embroidery machine here. And also I've decided to have my printer in the room with me here, and it looks a bit unsightly. As being a normal boring printer, I decided to cover it. So I did a cover for this as well. And I've also done a cover for my cover stitch machine, which is very similar to my overlocker. But I did make a pocket to put the foot in the side of it here. So with my overlocker, I actually have run the foot under the table, ready to use all the time. But with the cover stitch, because it's sort of in the middle of the desk, at the back though, of course, I've got the foot next to it, and then I pull that down when I need to use it. And actually I thought it'd be nice if I popped it in this little pocket here, so that I could keep it all nice and safe and dust free while I'm not using it. So I have got a B42 Funlock Bernina cover stitch machine, which is basically used for hemming jersey fabrics, and I'm very lucky to have it really, because it isn't a machine that you necessarily need for making jersey garments, but I treated myself one day. But I thought it'd be nice to have a really nice cover. It did have a plastic cover when it arrived, but it just doesn't look very nice, so I've been meaning to make a cover for ages. So now I've made one with this little pocket in here. I just love it. So I basically made it so these two pieces overlap by about an inch, so that I can pop the foot in. I can show you actually how the foot sort of fits in, hopefully. It can pop in there and keep the dust off it really, and keep it tidy and put away. Obviously the lead has to sort of run into there, but I just really like the way that works. And the rest of the cover has just got plain sides, similar to the overlocker that I had before. This fabric is some fabric that I sell in my shop actually, so I stole a couple of meters of it to do this cover, and also my embroidery machine cover as well. It's the same material, and I did the same line quilting on it, a centimetre apart, just to give it a nice texture, and it just makes it lovely and squishy. I used my sewing machine foot that I have for my faff machine. One of the feet was actually a centimetre from the needle point to the edge of the foot, so rather than having to use one of those bars that measures a sort of distance so that you can sew evenly across the work, it's just easier to use the edge of the foot. I did it in exactly the same way as I made the other one, except for I did the extra pocket on as well. But I basically cut the panels out, quilted them, and then I cut out the same size panels, but in a calico material. And this is a sort of calico material I had in my stash, but it doesn't really matter because it's on the inside. But I wanted to use calico because it's quite a nice, thick, sturdy material, so that when there's on my overlocker and on my cover stitch machine, there's bars that hold the threads at the back of the machine, so it might catch on the material. So I thought use a thicker material so that it lasts a bit longer. Once I'd got my outer and inner pieces together, I then just did some binding on the outside, and I used 2.5 inch binding. And I actually have a tutorial of how I do binding, because I did some binding on a Christmas advent calendar that I put a tutorial up for, and I will pop a link to how I did the binding on that in the description bar down below, because it shows you how I join it so that it was a really nice neat join. You can just about see there where the join is, and there's two of those because I've obviously had to cut a strip of material, and I had to have two pieces to go all the way around. But then when I joined those two together, I used the same joining method. So I will leave a link to that little tutorial in the description bar down below. But I'm really pleased with how those come out. So I basically copied the plastic cover the same sizes of that, same dimensions for this one, and I had a plastic cover for this machine as well. This machine, I'm pointing at in the slightly wrong position, but that's basically exactly the same thing but slightly different shape, just because the plastic cover that I had on it before was that shape and I just copied it. Let me pop this back on my cover stitch machine and I will briefly talk to you about this one. So this one here is the one I'm covering my printer with, which I'll quickly take off to show you. See, it's an unsightly printer, but I've basically done the same thing but with some different fabric that I had in my stash. So it's got the same sort of blue in it but with some gold and beige tones in there, and I basically just measured the front and the back of the printer. You can see that this edge is slightly taller than this edge because the back of the printer was taller. So I measured the height of the printer at the front and the back, and then I made a pattern piece to do the side panels, and I just basically constructed it as with the other machine covers. With this one, because I had to measure it to make the cover the right size, I basically took the width and I added 1/4 of an inch each side for the seam allowance, and then 1/4 of an inch each side for a sort of ease so that it would fit on the printer properly. So there we go, that pops over the top like that, and it's all covered so you can't see my unsightly printer. But it is very useful being back there, so it's like easy accessible rather than being in a separate room. But you could never know because it's all covered. So those covers now, I've made 4, one for my overlocker, one for my cover stitch, one for my embroidery machine, and one for my printer. That's one of my make 9s done, so that can be ticked off my list. So I now have a question from the Ask Me Anything thread on the Ravelry group, but you can also, if you don't have Ravelry, you can also just drop me an email on crafthousemagik@gmail.com and I will answer your question on the next podcast that's available. Of course, if I have tons of questions, it might take me a couple of weeks to get to it, but I do try and address them as soon as possible. So this question is from Becky, and there's 2 parts to the question, and it's actually really useful because the first part says, what shawl recommendations can I give for like 100 grams single skein of yarn? And I have knitted a few of these, so I thought I'd show you some of the single skein shawl patterns that I've had a go at. So the first one, I don't actually have it with me because my mum had the shawl, but I will pop a picture up so that you can see what it looks like. It's the Changing Staircases shawl by Hoard yarn, and it is a free pattern, so this is brilliant. So it's got some eyelets across it, but it's a sort of semi-crescent shape, but I have knitted that and it was a really fun knit. The one I actually knitted with the 100 gram skein, and then there was a 20 gram mini that was a contrast mini to go with it, and I actually knitted a couple of repeats in the mini at the end because it went really well together. So you could do that if you wanted to, but of course you could just use your 100 grams like it said. So that was the first one, but I do have samples of the others to show you. So the next one is the Lightweight Hipster shawl by Locatelli, and this is made of 1 single skein of yarn. And well, I tell you what I did do though, I ran out of yarn for all of the tassels, so I did add a navy blue mini that I'd got in my stash just to finish off those. I'd got enough for half of the tassels that I needed for the bottom, so what I did was place those further apart, and then when I'd made some more with the navy, I sort of alternated in between. But I think most people get their tassels out of a single skein as well. It's just that I think that this particular skein that I used was a little bit shorter. But isn't that lovely? What I will do is I'll pop a link to my project page from Ravelry, and it'll tell you which the yarns are, because I can't remember off the top of my head which yarns they were right now, but I do love this. There is a heavier weight hipster shawl with these beautiful lacy bits in. But this one's the light one. The only one I've knitted is the lighter one, so that's that one. It is quite a shorter length. With the 1 skein shawls, they obviously are a little bit shorter on the edges, but it's plenty to go around your neck, and I love the tassels. So that's the first one. I've got to show you. So then there's the Frizzen shawl by Brittany Wilson. I knitted this absolutely ages ago and I love the lace on this one. So this is a single skein shawl as well, and I just love these wedges of lace. Just think they're absolutely beautiful. And this one actually comes up longer but obviously narrower at the edges. This is actually knitted in some fondant fibre because I remember buying this particular one, and it looks something like this when it's on. There we go. So they tend to be obviously lighter weight shawls because they are one skein. It actually goes quite nicely with my dress that I'm wearing today. Had to put a dress on after watching the Sewing Bee last night. Very inspired to do some dressmaking now. So that was the Frizzen shawl by Brittany Wilson. Again, I will leave links to the patterns and my project pages in the description bar down below. The next one is the Antarctic shawl by Janina Callio, and again this has got some gorgeous lace on as well. More open weave at the bottom with some stripes. This one isn't quite as wide as the Frizzen one, but I did this in some gorgeous bright pink. I think that this was a Knit Picks yarn, but it was a long time ago when I knitted this. But I do find that actually this sort of bright pink goes with loads of things in my wardrobe anyway. So I've worn this an awful lot. Love this pattern as well. The next one, actually this isn't a shawl but it's a cowl that looks like a shawl, and it's the Midsummer Haze cowl, and this is a pattern by Locatelli. Now this looks really long, but when you've got it on it scrunches up. Got some beautiful lace on it, and I just love the look of this one. So this is a single skein as well. This is in 4-ply yarn, and it does say about knitting lace I think in the pattern as well, but this is a 4-ply 100 grams of yarn, and I just had enough for all the tassels as well, so that was good. I think I missed out a couple of the points at the back to put tassels on, but to be honest, you're not really going to see those. It's the ones at the front that you're going to see. But I love the way this looks on. Gorgeous, gorgeous lace pattern here. Really beautiful. So that's the cowl that I've thrown in the mix, which is almost like a shawl. But those are the ones that I've sort of had a go at and have samples of. But I think that there are loads and loads of single skein shawl patterns available out there. It's just a case of having a little look. So that's the first question from Becky. She's got a second question, and it was, what is my suggestions for using 5 20-gram mini skeins, because that is the set of minis, the size of set of minis that I do for my mixtape minis clubs, and she wanted some suggestions of what to do with it. Right, so Becky said she'd already had a go at like the Cozy Memories blanket, and then she did mention one other, but she wanted some more ideas. So number one I'd say is the Battenberg blanket that I've been working on now. That is a great way, but obviously it's crochet, it's whether you do crochet or not. I do like this because you can use tiny little bits of yarn left over as well, so that's always a nice thing to have on the go as a sort of side project that doesn't count in your list of things that you're working on, because it's a long-term project. Second thing I've got on my list is the northeasterly pattern. Now I have this is a northeasterly, but I made it into a scarf rather than a blanket that I knitted a couple of years ago. So I did just quite a long scarf shape out of mine, and it's basically a chevron pattern that works all the way along, and then you've got the pointy bits at this end and the open bits at this end, and I did some I-cord around the edge of this one. But this is a scarf instead of a blanket, but you could of course make it massive as a blanket, and I did find this pattern was quite addictive to knit on. So you just keep knitting with however long mini you've got until you finish that one and go on to the next one, and then it can be a little sample of all the different minis that you've been using. So you could put it in something like that if you're using your 20-gram minis, and But if you wanted something that was a little bit more sort of thinking about what colours you're putting it in and sort of blending from one to another, I wrote this pattern actually, which is called the Cupid's Arrow Wrap, and it is a wrap that's got a diagonal shape. This is slightly off centre. I've put tassels on mine, but of course you don't have to. And there are some sections with a little bit of lace and some sections without lace, and they're blended into each other. So if you had a couple of sets of minis that you thought went well together, those could be made into the Cupid's wrap. On this end there is the opposite effect with this sort of indentation. So you could do something like that. I used 12 20-gram minis for this length, but it is rather large, so you could probably get away with 10 minis, I think. What you also could do is, if you had a set of 5 minis, you could alternate it with an undyed yarn to sort of spread out the colours a little bit. If you thought they were a bit too in your face or too dark, alternating them would be a nice idea. It's a little bit like spreading the colours out on the Battenberg blanket with the plain ones in between. So that's another idea. I also thought you could do a stripy pair of socks. So I've got a free pattern called the Simple Top Down Sock Pattern, which is available both on Ravelry and on my website. But you could use that to make a pair of socks. And you could do sort of, say, 12 rows for the cuff in one colour. And you could match the other one if you wanted to match it exactly. And then you could do sort of 10 or 12 rows of each colour and stripe it along, and just have fun playing with the colours really. You could always put a couple of rows of an undyed yarn in between those if you wanted to spread them out. But there's always lots of lovely ideas for using minis with socks really. And you can always try and sew your ends in as you go with socks, otherwise you might end up with a lot of ends, which could be annoying at the end. But there are ways of sewing your ends in socks as you go. I will leave a link to one of those tutorials that might help if you're interested in making scrappy socks. The next idea I had was to do the Land of Sweets cowl by Helen Stewart. I have had this idea in mind to have a go for ages. The Land of Sweets cowl, I think you require a few more minis than just 5, but you could just do a shorter cowl. The Land of Sweets cowl is quite a long cowl anyway, so you could do a shorter cowl with your 5 minis, because if you have the mixtape minis sets, they're all coordinated, and there's different textures along the cowl, so that might be fun to knit. So you'd have little stripes of different colours. And last but not least is the 6 Wives shawl. So I have a sample of one of these, and it is basically a full skein of whatever colour, and then you use 5 little minis on the edge for the stripes. So you could use an undyed yarn or a yarn that you think goes really nicely with the 5. This particular one is just knitted with a single thread at a time, but it does say that you could use some mohair held together at the same time, which will blend the colours together. But I do think it's quite good because you can use sort of a set of minis that go well together if you can find either an undyed yarn or a yarn that you think goes nicely with the rest of the stripes. So this pattern is called the 6 Wives shawl, and it's by Potter and Bloom. Again, for any of these patterns that I've mentioned, I will leave a link in the description bar down below so that you can find out more details about them. So there we go, that's the Ask Me Anything questions, and I just have my shop update to talk to you about now. So on Friday the 18th of June at 7 PM, my July yarn clubs will be available. So they will be available on my website to pre-order until the 4th of July, and I plan to ship them on the 16th of July, but they may be shipped a little bit earlier than that. We shall see how I get on, but they will be shipped by the 16th of July. And I also wanted to mention that there will be a shop update on some of the higher knitting needles as well this Friday, because I was a bit low on stock on some of the different needles. They're still short on some of the 5-inch bamboo tips and some of the other bamboo needles at the warehouse, but I'm keeping an eye on the stock levels there and trying to update my website as quickly as I can. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I shall see you in the next episode. Bye!